como da barragem Mariana, o derramamento de petróleo no litoral nordestino, os incêndios no Pantanal têm piorado os diagnósticos. Além disso, essas preocupações têm contribuído para enfraquecer cada vez mais a imagem do Brasil, enquanto o país vinha demonstrando ao longo desses últimos 20 anos um significativo comprometimento com a agenda ambiental. Certo, mas o que pode ser atribuído ao governo atual? De quais mudanças estamos falando concretamente? E para além da Amazônia, o que podemos dizer sobre a degradação em outros biomas brasileiros? Acreditamos ser necessário estudar mais detalhadamente esse tema, principalmente a um mês das próximas eleições presidenciais, para assim trazer perspectivas e reflexões a partir de diversos ângulos. O primeiro, compartilhar informações. Assim, o colóquio tem dois objetivos principais, né? O primeiro é compartilhar informações e conhecimentos, análises e reflexões sobre diferentes temas ambientais para facilitar a compreensão dos processos atuais. Também achamos que seria importante dialogar sobre diferentes pontos de vista entre a Europa e o Brasil. O segundo objetivo é suscitar com isso debates e reações, assim como alimentar a reflexão sobre as perspectivas sobre o meio ambiente no contexto das próximas eleições, cujo primeiro turno acontecerá dentro de aproximadamente 15 dias. As apresentações serão divididas em 3 mesas redondas. A primeira procura refletir sobre a ideia da ruptura na política ambiental com o governo Bolsonaro. A segunda busca avaliar efeitos concretos do mandato atual presidente. E a terceira foca nas reações e resistências à agenda do governo. E uma quarta e última mesa buscará trazer uma síntese entre os diversos temas discutidos e abrir um espaço para outros temas também. Então, agradecemos a todos os palestrantes e moderadores pela cooperação e os nossos parceiros institucionais, que são o Centro de Pesquisa e Documentação sobre as Américas, o CREDA, da Universidade Sorbonne Nouvelle, o Instituto dos Altos Estudos da América Latina, o IHEAL, e o Instituto das Américas, o IDA. Agradecemos também a Associação ARBRE, Associação para a Pesquisa sobre o Brasil na Europa, o Laboratório Prodigue, da Universidade Paris I, e a Rede de Políticas Públicas e Desenvolvimento Rural na América Latina, que nos apoiaram todos, né, financeiramente para a realização desse evento. Agradecemos também aos nossos 2 intérpretes e lembramos a todos os palestrantes e recomendamos a todos os palestrantes que falem lentamente para garantir uma boa tradução do evento. Desejamos a todos um ótimo colóquio e pedimos, por favor, aos que nos acompanham online, que desativem seus microfones e evitem múltiplas entradas e saídas durante os 2 dias de evento, a fim de facilitar a moderação. É isso. Mais uma vez, agradecemos a todos, né? E vou passar a palavra agora para o David Dumoulin, que é professor no Instituto de Altos Estudos da América Latina e foi um dos nossos principais parceiros para a realização desse evento. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Marion. Vou tentar falar em português, em brasileiro. Não é fácil para mim usar o brasileiro acadêmico, mas é com prazer, não? Então, boa tarde a todos aqui na França, boa tarde para os que nos acompanham no Brasil. Só lembra-me uma canção, uma ukulele, não? É bom dia para quem é de bom dia, boa noite para quem é de boa noite, mas essa é outra relação com o Brasil que eu tenho. Mas, ok, hoje estou tomando essa palavra só para 3 minutos, apenas para dizer que é um grande prazer para mim abrir esse evento do parte do CREDA, no Centro de Pesquisa e Documentação sobre as Américas, do CNRS, e o Instituto de Altos Estudos da América Latina, IHEAL. Bueno. Creio que o IHEAL é um instituto agora localizado aqui no Campus Condorcet, é um lugar ideal para esse dia de estudo que visa apresentar e discutir o conhecimento científico enquanto assume a politização do contexto, não? Há um mês da próxima eleições presidenciais que dá um sabor particular a estes debates de hoje e de amanhã. Além disso, o IHEAL é um instituto, no passado, sediu tal agora, onde a frieza das análises esbarra no calor da atualidade latino-americana para iluminá-la. Uma memorável, eu lembro, uma conferência que foi organizada pouco antes da seleção do Jair Bolsonaro, em outubro de 2018. Então, é um lugar onde podemos dialogar sobre diferentes pontos de vista entre a Europa e Brasil, como sempre no Instituto, não é? Somos um ponte entre Europa e América Latina. Então, só isso. Gostaria de acrescentar que nosso laboratório, o CREDA, tive todo o interesse em financiar esse dia de estudo para mostrar seu suporte às iniciativas dos doutorandos e doutores, iniciativas autônomas e muito relevantes, para fomentar um programa tão interessante, tão completo. Você viu o tamanho do programa impressionante, que reúne um painel de palestrantes que acho realmente impressionante. Este apoio me parece particularmente legítimo quando nos permite trazer tantos pesquisadores de qualidade para o debate, como, por exemplo, Susanna Hecht ou Raoni Rajão, que saludo agora. Nossa discussão nos próximos dias, 2 dias, convergirão tematicamente com um seminário de uma de nossa linha de pesquisa aqui no CREDA, Transição Ecológicas Americanas, e com um colóquio internacional sobre ecologia política latino-americana, organizado faz 2 anos e que dará origem a um livro coletivo no início de 2023. Então, só sem tomar mais de seu tempo, gostaria só de felicitar as organizadoras, todo o trabalho que foi feito para tornar essa conferência possível. Então, Marion Dogear, Lívia Khalil, os dois fizeram estudos no CREDA, no IHEAL, Marina Yamaoka, Natalia Capellini, bravo pelo trabalho coletivo, e gostaria de felicitar todas as palestrantes, moderadores que ficam aqui, os intérpretes, bravo, Sarava. Bom, desejo-lhes apresentações desafiadoras e discussões empolgantes. Obrigado, tchau.
Só, antes de tudo, vou fazer um comentário técnico. Opa. D'après besoin d'interprétation en français, vous venez prendre l'équipement avec moi au fond. Então, voltando para o português, eu queria convidar a Susanna Hecht para vir fazer a sua apresentação, a sua conferência inaugural. Pode vir, ok? Susanna, daí você senta aqui. Ok. Deixa eu sentar aqui com você também. Do seu lado. Daí você... E a Marina vai falar.
All right. Oh, I have to, yes, exactly. I see what's going on. I have to be, yeah, I have to be in 2 places at once. Bom, vou fazer a minha apresentação em inglês, mas vocês podem fazer as questões, as interrogações as intervenções em qualquer idioma que quer.
Peraí,
Que
Susanna.
você...
Eu ia te apresentar.
Oh, não,
Desculpa,
não.
que estamos com algumas coisas. É porque eu estou cuidando da parte técnica, embora
Não.
não seja uma pessoa técnica. Se tivermos problemas com o híbrido, desculpa, gente.
Uhum.
Então, primeiramente, eu queria dizer que é um grande prazer para mim apresentar a Susanna Hecht, que vai fazer a abertura do evento hoje. Então, que vai acontecer excepcionalmente em inglês, vai ser a única parte do evento em inglês e a gente não vai ter tradução simultânea. Desculpem. Então, a Susanna, para quem não a conhece, ela é diretora do Centro de Estudos Brasileiros da UCLA, a Universidade de Califórnia, dos Estados Unidos, e ela também é professora no Instituto de Altos Estudos Internacionais e de Desenvolvimento de Genebra. Ela é uma pesquisadora muito interdisciplinar, normalmente ela é apresentada como uma geógrafa, mas eu acho que a gente também pode dizer que ela é uma historiadora.
Uhum.
Ela tem uma ampla pesquisa focalizada em mudança no uso dos solos nos trópicos, transição florestal e agricultura na América Latina, e especialmente na Amazônia. Ela também é uma das fundadoras da abordagem analítica que a gente chama de ecologia política hoje, e o seu trabalho sempre se empenhou em ter uma relevância social através da compreensão das dinâmicas que sustentam o desmatamento e as suas alternativas. Ela tem diversos artigos e livros publicados, e para citar só alguns, ela escreveu um clássico que chama Fate of the Forest, Destroyers, Developers and Defenders of the Amazon, junto com Alexander Cockburn, e ela também escreveu o livro Scramble for the Amazon and the Lost Paradise of Euclides da Cunha, que ganhou diversos prêmios. O trabalho da Susanna é muito reconhecido. Em 2018, ela recebeu a medalha do centenário de David Livingstone, da Sociedade Geográfica Estadunidense, como reconhecimento pela sua carreira e pelo seu trabalho. Então, sem mais delongas, eu agradeço muitíssimo a Susanna pela sua participação e eu passo a palavra para ela.
Bom, muito obrigada. Sou extremamente feliz de ser aqui. Eu vou fazer a minha apresentação em inglês, mas depois a gente vai traduzir as slides em português e francês para os que não querem compartilhar esse idioma imperialista. Mas, de qualquer maneira, para mim é muito mais fácil fazer as apresentações em inglês, por ser um pouco mais preciso em o que quero dizer. Então, eu chamei esta apresentação Amazon Alchemy, e realmente é sobre a questão de uma, dizemos, experiência, um experimento natural de fazer de uma coisa uma outra coisa, e neste caso da vida natural, os recursos naturais em várias formas de capital. Mas essa não, como os alquimistas do passado, não era uma coisa simplesmente de botar uma straw, uma graminha dentro de uma fogo e sair com ouro. Mas, de fato, isso também ocorre no Brasil, mas também de olhar um pouco mais amplo a dinâmica de mudança dentro dessa nova, como dizemos, natural experiment, de fazer uma diferença vinculada com as questões de um ramo de intervenções e, de repente, tirá-los. Então, eu vou continuar agora em inglês. Volta. Wait. Ok, Amazon Alchemy. Também eu acho que é importante de falar dos tipping points, dos momentos no qual o sistema em si muda profundamente, porque nós estamos dentro de uma situação assim na Amazônia, ou também temos um forte tipping point social, socioeconômica, sociocultural e ecológica e socioambiental, e também um tipping point, dizemos, do lado política. A outra coisa que também é fundamental é a questão do tipping point do ecossistema. Então, eu vou falar de 3 tipping points. Esta de 1988, a eleição de Jair Bolsonaro e também os câmbios e as modificações da Amazônia em si. Ok, começamos aqui. Bom, I've put this up primarily because it's the oldest rock art, the petroglyphs that we have in Amazonia. They're 14,000 years old. They're about the same age as those of Lascaux. If you remember Lascaux, what you have in Lascaux is a couple of horses and some bison. You don't have this panoply of animal diversity, of ecosystem diversity, of representation of different ecosystems. So one of the things that is really profound in the sort of cultural heritage, and I'll make reference to this in a little bit, is the complexity that was part of the socio-environmentalism that was so profound in Amazonia and still remains so, but is under the threat of cultural erasure. And it's really important to look at this and think about this. And often, if I have more time, I put a bunch of these on, as well as Lascaux, to give you an idea of really the complexity. And now we're beginning to see that probably the Amazon was occupied much earlier than was thought in the mid-Holocene. So what I'm going to try and do also is give, because there's going to be so much excellent work in the panels and detailed work on policies and practices, I thought I would go with a couple of big so-called big ideas, big framing ideas, as we think about this, because I think it's important that somehow we need to do a different kind of connection, and you'll see where I'm going with this. But basically, what we need to understand is that we are entering a very systemic moment of instability. So one of the things that people in systems ecology and so on work on is the idea that systems, it's like as Great Gatsby says in one of those books, is you go bankrupt at first very slowly and then all at once. So systems have this dynamic of buffering and then collapse. So I teach a course on collapsology, so I get a little bit overwhelmed by this particular dynamic, which you see played out again and again. It's not that there's an incremental dynamic and somehow you can bend the curve because it's incremental. The problem is that it's exponential and takes a lot of energy and will and everything to turn that around. So this is one of the important things. The second thing is when systems reorganize, they don't necessarily go back to where they were. And particularly in this context where you have these outer external effects, as well as the internal dynamics of the ecosystems and sociosystems themselves, they're very unlikely to go back to something that we've seen before. The other thing I think is important to keep in mind is that the idea of resilience involves redundancy. It involves many other dimensions of these systems. It's not just one thing. You can't just fix one thing, which is sort of the tragedy of policymakers. They often think, and it's a sin I partake of, that if you just did this one thing, everything will be fine. Well, actually, these have their own dynamics. So it's very important not to just think of systems policy as part of it, working on an incremental system, but how things change when you're in an acceleration. I'm not going to go through too much of this, but just to keep in mind that we have a lot of nonlinearities, and I think Raoni will probably talk about this in your other Palestinians also. The other thing is that the alternatives that are offered are things like multiple modernities, that you can be in a modern system and have certain kinds of dimensions to them that don't all partake of simplification and monoculture. So this is an important element because Amazonia, as many of you know, is extremely complex. The other thing is that there's an emerging concept of pluriverses, which is that you don't have to really, you can do a sort of hybrid thing, but you can also do a number of complexities. And I think one of the things we see in some of the indigenous movements is the pressure for pluriverses. So this is something to keep in mind. But the other thing we really want to keep in mind, particularly with the great acceleration that we're experiencing, the big external changes associated with climate change and big external changes below planetary processes, globalization processes, and local processes, is that not all Anthropocenes are the same. So we're talking often now about, oh, the Anthropocene, as if there was like, you know, the cloak of the Anthropocene came on. In fact, there are many, as I say, Anthropocenes. That's partly why I put on that first slide, is to give you a sense and a little memory that not all Anthropocenes are the same. And it's something that we need to really keep in mind. The other thing is that I think I don't know whether you're familiar with the work of Stephen Pine, but his argument these days is that we're not really in the Anthropocene per se, we're in a Pyrocene. And what he means by that is that the activities have a kind of positive feedback mechanism that keeps burning things burning more. And I think we can see this in like places like California, for example, and certainly with the fragmentation and dynamics that we see in Amazonia, which is that they sort of enter into sort of self-replicating processes. So if we had the Ice Age, the Holocene, we now have the Age of Fire. And I'm particularly worried about this because of this whole movement into these areas that are basically white sand soil areas in the center Amazon, which are on unallocated terras devolutas, with roads going, just aiming for them. And those are kind of irreversible processes. But anyway, there's more on this later. But it's important to think about that if we go into tipping points, we move maybe from a bunch of different kinds of Anthropocenes into a Pyrocene, where almost every kinds of many activities start to re-stimulate and positively affect more fire. The other thing is, as one does, keep going, well, we can just sort of sit and talk about disasters, but how do we talk about Anthropocenes? So I'm taking a little bit of a hint here from the anthropologist Anna Tsing, who is always talking about ghost landscapes. And what I would argue here is that maybe we should think about some other kinds of things. Poor Raoni had to listen to a paper on the angels of desolation. I keep, flogging this, but I finally thought, well, why not? And I'll give you those later if you want. But the ghost landscapes are interesting because they can be either sort of the basis for a new set of alternatives, and we could think of the stuff associated with the anthropogenic Amazon, such as Terra Preta. We can think of these complex forests that have been manipulated, domesticated landscapes as essentially ghost landscapes, which we, in my more perverse moments, I would think of these as being Casper the Friendly Ghost. Or you can think of them as imperial rubble, or, the ghost of Christmas future, which comes clanking in with its chain. With that ghost landscape, you get a lot, not a bunch of potentialities, but a bunch of path dependencies. The other thing I was thinking, so we have ghost landscapes, we have zombie landscapes, and those are the living dead. But they have the capacity to kill other things. So I think that if we take the long historical view, the zombie landscape of the par excellence that we might look at would be something like the livestock systems. After all, the bovine face was the friendly face of colonialism as it marched through various coastal to the interior areas of Brazil. But the other thing is that it becomes sort of, and it was the mechanism through, and has historically been a mechanism of a great deal of dispossession, and particularly from the mid-20th century forward, but not, it causes all sorts of other problems in terms of being basically the primordial land grabber and land grabbing institution, and also the mechanism through which private property has been created time and time again in the Brazilian context. The other thing is that it also creates the possibilities for infusing into the piracy. So this, I think, is also important to keep in mind, that it is a mechanism that reproduces itself almost quite easily without necessarily requiring huge amounts of energy. Although that's not to say that it doesn't do nothing. But the point is that as the largest land system in Amazonia, it has a particular power, and it extends itself very easily, particularly as these landscapes more generally become pyrogenic. The other thing is the vampire landscapes that basically suck everything away. And the Frankenstein landscapes, you know, the technology gone amiss, gone awry into a kind of murderous framing. And those, I think we could, if we're thinking about landscapes, not export value, we could be thinking of the soy and palm oil thing. Again, I would say that we can, if we look at these, we can see different kinds of modernities that emerge from these. That is, these things don't all have the same set of social relations around them, and they don't all have the same histories. They don't all have the same assemblages that in which they operate. So it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing is that they have particular linkages in terms of capital accumulation, and also in terms of tipping points, and also in terms of, let's say, the geographic locus. I'm going to now go to what I think is a really important tipping point, and I'll document this in a minute. In fact, actually what I'd like to do is I'm going to go first to, in my moments of heartbreak this morning as I was fighting with my little computer, what's important to look at in terms of these is basically you can see here, I can't see it, but you can, that we can go through different kinds of political regimes and socio-environmental regimes that give us different kinds of landscapes. They give us different kinds of pyrocenes over time and Anthropocenes over time. So it's important to keep in mind that, and I know everybody here is very familiar with that 2004 to 2012 decline. Then we have the problems of Temer and so on, and then the Bolsonaro time, and then we go into the Great Acceleration. But let me go back to 1988, because this is a tipping point. And I think sometimes one forgets, you think it's just a bunch of stuff that goes in the Constitution, but it really did fundamentally change, shall we say, the socio-environmental relations within the Brazilian culture, socioculture and environmental culture. It really was the first constitution that had a deeply environmental and culturally complex flavor to it, and centered the Constitution on that. So one of the things that it did is the expansion of rights and resources and processes. So one was lots more new institutions. So these are incarnated in these institutions, new kinds of environmental laws, emergent legal frameworks. None of this existed, you know. So we go from sort of zero into a panoply of really interesting things. The emergence of environmental markets, payment for environmental services, and RED. Agroecological markets become very salient, and of course, I don't see quite the interest in acai around here that is comfortable for me in Los Angeles, where every corner has a little acai bowl shop. One never knows whether it's money laundering or what, but on the other hand, it's there and has catapulted that old crop, that's almost 8,000-year-old crop, acai, tree crop, into a modern health food and $1 billion a year thing. Enterprises. It's also the emergence of extensive social movements that were part of the democratization, but also explode afterwards. Also the recognition of different kinds of property regimes. the formal recognition and the institutionalization of that. So while it may be that indigenous people have had their territories, they couldn't be recognized particularly well under the existing legal system. So this is also an important thing. The other thing is the emergence of green governance, and both to control destructive activity and to enhance better action. So this is the projeto piloto kind of things, and also social movements who begin to claim these things. Again, let's see, here we go. So 1988, and you can see, you know, we really do, it takes a while to get this stuff in place, but it really does translate into a different set of activities and a different approach to environment. Well, now what we're going to do is have our little natural experiment. Now, people in the social sciences and sciences love natural experiments because they tell you a lot about how the system is functioning. So having described this wonderful situation, and it's not that other thing, you know, there was no deforestation. There were huge amounts of leakage. There was a lot of capital movement into Bolivia. Mato Piba starts to get more attention, and the Cerrado, southern Brazil, starts to fall. But those are kind of invisibilities because of the iconic nature of Amazonia. But in any case, we start to have Bolsonaro as another tipping point, I would say, which is, and this important natural experiment, which is what happens, what would happen if you just took all the environmental controls off? Boom, we're just going to get rid of them. So I'll go through, I'm sure there will be more of this discussed, but it's important to, and I'll give you sort of more precision in this, but what you can see is if I go through this, I'm just not going to have very much time to finish up. And as I say, we'll put this up and we'll put up translations of it so that people who aren't really into the imperial language still can understand what we're talking about. So Amazon Alchemy, as I've titled this, is basically what do you do to take what had been a legal system and an environmental, how shall we say, framing in its development process, which was very unique and very powerful, and turn it into something else. And the question I have, particularly in light of the coming election, is whether you can turn things around. So this is a little bit like we have the Amazon Alchemy, but we also have the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is that once you pick, it's like Trump, once you figure out that you can push the boundaries, there's no reason not to push them anymore unless, you know, you have, that's respecting boundaries is part of your deal. But there are several mechanisms through which you turn what you do is organize this, what do you call it, natural experiment. Remember that there are also big problems in the economy, and in a certain sense, and we can discuss this later, Amazonia has a sort of internal colonial dynamic with its nation states. But what you have is, one, political takeovers within the formal government, the destruction of institutions, creation of the debility of institutions and their restructuring. The importance of ideology should never be underestimated. Those of us living in very divided societies, you know, get a little exhausted by this ideological demonization. But Amazonia is an obstacle to development, a result of international conspiracies, the elitism of opposition, the problems of patriots who don't follow Mr. Bolsonaro, environmental racism, we can talk about that, climate denial, but also there are these kind of religious ideas that go with evangelical religions, which is providentialism, which is that we are meant here to finish God's work. And so we should do that, and we should do it for profit. And the other is dominionism, which is we are the masters of all nature. So these are important things to keep in mind. And the reanimating of zombies and Frankensteins by giving them a lot of support through institutional rents such as credit, roads, research, and other kinds of things. There's a panoply of them. The other thing is changing laws and rights and procedures. So this becomes also an extremely important part. Legalizing the illegal, so the amnesties of amnesty things, and also redefinition. So this is basically de-gazetting areas. That is, if you are a national park or a reserva extractivista, changing it into you can do whatever you want. The pacote, the destrução, was pretty much all about changing the illegal to the legal. Mining on indigenous lands, you can use whatever toxics you want, and so on. The other thing is the processes of invisibilizing and the natures of the clandestine. I'm sure Relanie will be talking more about that. But what we begin to see in Amazonia is that there's much more stuff that's covert. And I think the recent assassinations of Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira sort of, what that did is it brought focus into a huge area of clandestinidade. The natures of the clandestine are those which permit it to go forward in a very destructive way. All of these have their own path dependencies, by the way, and their own natures. They all have their own Anthropocenes. So I know it's boring. You've seen these a million times. You've probably used them in your own PowerPoints constantly. But certainly what you can see is a dramatic change in the Amazon biome writ large. And if we want to turn it into the Pyrocene, let's look at this. And so what you see is the really fundamental transformation of these systems as they go forward. Now, I tend to like this particular image because instead of the usual soy and forest kind of thing, this is an engraving done by a Paraguayan Guarani. And basically what this does is it talks about all the other kinds of destruction that goes along, all the animals, all the plants, all these other kinds of things that are essentially transmogrified into these logs that move into the timber thing. And I think we all are kind of used to seeing this. The numbers are quite astonishing, but let me go forward. And I know that I have to move pretty quickly here. First of all, the illegal and the clandestine have, a cozy relationship if they are not exactly the same thing. But land grabbing is one of the central mechanisms through capital gains and citizen rights. So what we're seeing in this process is large-scale privatization. And you get, of course, there's the land grabbing through speculative gains, which is thrilling in itself. But should you not do that and keep part of it for your own particular use, you get a bouquet, shall we say, of rights and I won't say responsibilities because these don't require responsibilities, but rather you get rights and resources below ground, on the ground, and above. We think about red. You get political rights because you can you can be part of a political movement. You get citizens' claims, you get institutional rents, and you can get very strong links to corruption as well. So it's really important to see how central land grabbing becomes in this and why amnesty becomes so important and why non-prosecuting becomes important. I would put on an image, but it's from a journal article that I've been asked to review, so it's actually confidential, but okay, I have 1 minute, 5 minutes, 4 minutes. See, I don't have my long glasses. Anyway, we'll make it. So those become really important. These questions about how you capture a bunch of rights is often lost in this larger, it's sort of reduced to its economics or its cruelty, rather than actually that there's a lot of things that go with this land grabbing. And certainly there's a lot of political hay to be made. There's also the laundering of nature. And again, Raoni will be, I'm sure, are you going to talk about this? No laundering of gold to Switzerland? Wait, all right, well, never mind. But anyway, what you have is basically processes through which you can take things that are illegal and turn them into, so this is the classic alchemy, take illegal gold, go to the bank and have it turned into real gold that is legal. Cattle laundering, of course, where you take illegally raised cattle and put it on a legal parcel and then send it off to the United States or Europe. Plunder laundering, you know, all you need to do is change the ticket or change the location. So there's a lot of laundry systems, the laundromat, if you will, going on with this. And also there's a lot of blind eyes up and down the chain, and also it's got strong links to corruption, as we know. And then again, redefinitions and rebranding and invisibilities. My favorite rebranding right now is the Zona de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, Madeira Abuna, which is like the area right now that has some of the highest rates of deforestation. But it's supposed to be, but if you just read the articles or read the explanation, it looks like everything will be fine. And it's meant to be the model for Tefe, for Marajó, and areas on the Transam. And then the other thing is new forms of financialization. It can be legal, illegal, but limited public pressure points. So I'm going to just move on here. I think one of the central thing is that this dynamic, which I've been describing, the Amazon alchemy, and the Sorcerer's Apprentice, doesn't exactly translate into a wonderful world. It's good for some, less good for others. But the importance of atmosphere, I know you're all familiar with this, but atmospheric, what do you call it? Atmospheric rivers, the atmospheric cooling with evapotranspiration. This has huge implications for the South American water system. So the problems that we're seeing of the Pantanal, the huge drought for the last couple of years in the Southern Cone, and the sort of drying of the Paraná River. So there's hydro problems, there's water accessibility problems, and of course, biodiversity and livelihood things. Also, the question of Amazonia's vulnerability to tipping points. The other thing is that as we change things, remember that 30% of Amazonia is wetlands, so that you're starting to convert wetlands, and you don't necessarily have to cut them down for them to start emitting methane. And these vegetations on white sand soils, and in general, the idea that CO2 emissions are largely underestimated. And I'm moving right along here. What I'm trying to show you is that the carbon bombs are coming down the pike, particularly with this movement onto white sand soils and the development of dynamics in the upper Amazon. And I have 1 minute, and I'm just going to zoom ahead here. But anyway, so carbon bombs in our futures. And so let me get to the final point here. The great acceleration in the dynamics of change at planetary, globalized, and local levels are really important, and it makes transform. So Lula may come in and want to do everything, but the dynamics are already in place. So this is a little bit like Lindsey Graham's abortion law, you know, which is that time runs out and then you can't do anything about it. The next thing is the natural experiment that I've described really shows what happens when you take away protections, which is the place blows up because of a number of economic dynamics. It's not just one thing, it's not just one policy. So that's another thing I'm kind of worried about vis-a-vis the Lula election. The other thing is that there are also higher order instabilities going on at the level of climate. I wouldn't need to tell you about forest fires and the droughts in Europe, the burning of the Iberian Peninsula, or talking even about California or the United States, which is also going up in smoke. But the point is that there are higher order instabilities that are moving far faster. And that the models were made to seem a little bit like, well, I'll be dead by 2100, as opposed to this is going to hit like right now. So there's that. The other thing is that, as I say, the ghosts of the past can be either ghost landscapes that can help you, or those that will turn things into imperial rubble. So it's important to keep this in mind. The other thing is that there are multiple Anthropocenes, so we have to think about them, the Anthropocene, not as just one thing, but as a complex of strategies of human engagement with nature that can be mobilized and understood. And we're at a moment of high ecological and political instabilities. I don't need to tell you guys that, with a tipping clock on the tipping points, and particularly the Amazonian tipping points, which are multiple, but look like they are imminent. So I just put this up again. And this thing, of course, you're very familiar with. This is the that U curve that we've come to love. And of course, my favorite photograph, the dominant land use at Amazon, the queen of the Amazon. So there you go. So thank you very much for your patience. I think I'm in time. Yes. I probably talked too fast, but that's the only way I can get through it. Okay, your questions, comments? I leave her up.
Agora está aberto para perguntas. Se alguém quiser comentar ou perguntar alguma coisa, por favor, temos que vir aqui para perto para as pessoas que estão online conseguirem escutar também. E o pessoal que está online também, se quiser fazer algum comentário ou questão, pode se inscrever no chat. E a Lívia vai falar para a gente.
Eu também pode fazer respostas em qualquer idioma, se em português ou francês, como vocês querem. É somente essa apresentação em português.
Eu sei que tem que vir aqui na frente, mas ninguém precisa ficar tímido.
Well, Raoni, por favor.
Pode ser só aqui, é só para eu ficar perto do microfone.
I'll hug you both. Yes. So fantastic. I really like, the how you dealt with the issues of the tipping points and tests, and I think I would like to hear a bit more of how do you consider this more this alchemic process and those transformations under Bolsonaro, and the role of science even before. Now we wrote about those things, and how in the sense they have been attempts to scientifically transform the Amazon into a breadbasket, and now to transform that back into a safe haven, right? And the clashes between that. So it would be great to hear a little bit more about the role of knowledge in those processes.
In one of my lists, enormous lists there, I talk about how it sort of went from a state of knowledge, which really sort of began, it has to be said, in the military period, with a lot of investment in science, a lot of training in science internationally and nationally, and the development of a scientific infrastructure, and actually a scientific infrastructure associated with remote sensing, which is, admired by the world. So the point is that it starts off with trying to think about how one might do these kinds of things, but primarily within a modernist framework, which is, as I was thinking about this, and as I'm writing a book on this period from 1988 to now, so I think about it a lot. And I remember, and I'm a person who wandered and hiked and did all this stuff a lot within the American Western nature. And the thing that I found most interesting, the first time I tried to go for a walk in the forest without an Indian telling me what to do and where to go, was I thought, normally I have really good botanical information. I have a really good sense of space and direction. I thought, I don't have a clue. And I think it was this modernist idea of simplification into a legible landscape that could be amenable to forms of what we might call normal science, and particularly so in agronomic science. So we start off with sort of the knowledge systems of agronomy, engineering, and economics as framing these questions. What adds on later are things like ethnography and then ecology, in terms of thinking about this. So we can think of environmental services as being, if you will, the economization of ecology. But in essence, what you need is an interpreter. And so it's not for nothing that the Amazon assessment says, you know, indigenous knowledge is kind of where it's at about what we need to do here, because our models will only work insofar as we eliminate these kinds of systems. The other thing is that this business of de-gazetting, you know, of saying, well, that was a protected area, but we take it back. And or this is a terras devolutas, and we're going to just throw stuff. We'll throw a road through it, and then, you know, sauve qui peut. So I think that we are in a moment and the other thing is from states of knowledge to social media as well, so that the dynamic shifts less to the science. And remember, it's full of science deniers. Araujo was a climate denier. Bolsonaro probably is, but won't say because, you know, that will cause him trouble. But what you have also then is the sort of, you know, we're here to do God's work. And, you know, so that this may look horrible to you. You can think, you can think of the Mennonites right now in Peru. You know, they just say, well, we're doing God's work. And, you know, this forest is just standing here. So we're going to turn it into something else. So there are a whole set of ideological things that run really counter to science and also counter to the long-term sustainability. So the thing that we know from areas in southern Pará and old soybean areas that, you know, that about 30% of Amazonia is in some kind of degraded form. And if you look at the subcanopy degradation, it's extreme. Sasan says it goes out about 50 kilometers from the roads, that there's huge understory. I'm referring to Sasan Sachi, a colleague of mine and a friend of Raoni's as well, who does the carbon balance for the Amazon. And, you know, he's at Jet Propulsion Laboratories. He's got these fancy satellites that, you know, measure a lot of the biomass and the carbon under the, and the low, which you can't see from above. And so what we're seeing is like levels of degradation that certainly match the amount of emissions that you see from actual deforestation. So the problem that we have is really, in some sense, an ideological problem on a couple of dimensions. One is that the initial modernist vision was set-asides and industrial agriculture in a certain sense. That is, okay, you can have your forest and then we'll have industrial agriculture. It wasn't humanized. It was Amazonia as wild nature and then a domesticated nature, and not as a human created, a humanly built environment. So the premises that begin it are problematic. And then the political dimension of, you know, these are Indians and quilombolas and traditional people. What do they know? The primitivization of knowledge and derogation of indigenous knowledge that also is very important in this whole process. And then finally, the increasingly important, the Jesuits, you know, not to give them too much of a break, but still, you know, they were rather interested in indigenous knowledge systems, whether it was agriculture or drugs or whatever it was. But this particular set of religious interests in Amazonia is much more concerned about sort of Jesus wants you to be rich. And the other thing is that it's a right, that we have a divinely interceded right to do this, and that the forest is an obstacle to development, and dominionism and providentialism provide us with a rationale that is non-scientific about doing what we would like. And then, you know, we have, if we will, consolidated technologies, at least on the livestock sector, which means almost anybody can do it. It's not that easy, but it's not that hard. You don't have to run a lot of machinery, for example, like you do in soy. So in any case, I think if we put this into a broader perspective, you can see that the idea that science alone could master Amazonia sort of took it into a much more, thought of it as a much more simplistic thing, but also the geopolitics, the legibility, and of the spatial legibility, and then the idea of a sort of technical recipes a la Green Revolution. So all of those sort of converge in what becomes the dominant model. And it's only, you get that moment where you get alternatives coming in, but they are not as coherent and they're harder to manage. And it's, pluriverses and multiple ethnic, so they're much less legible, so politically less powerful.
Tinha mais uma pergunta ali, vocês querem fazer os dois a pergunta ao mesmo tempo, daí você responde as duas junto? Pode ser?
Pode ser, mas eu preciso de uma caneta para...
Alguém tem uma caneta? Pode pegar.
Somente...
Obrigada, Pedro. Você pode vir aqui falar perto da câmera e depois você...
Em português, em inglês?
Pode falar. Pode falar como
quiser.
Meu nome é Willy Del Valle, eu sou jornalista e doutorando. Eu pesquiso a questão da ingerência ecológica em relações internacionais. Na última passagem do ex-presidente Lula por Paris, ele disse numa coletiva de imprensa que trabalhará para que o acordo de livre comércio, associando a União Europeia ao Mercosul, viabilize a proteção do meio ambiente. É possível?
Tudo depende. O problema é o laundromat. A outra coisa é que é relativamente fácil de mudar os selos de produção, de origem e tudo isso. Se não fosse tão corrupto neste momento, talvez seria mais fácil. A outra coisa é que depende da dinâmica também do setor. Então, se você tem só moratório, mas essa não fica continuando, então não funciona tão bem. É um modelo, é uma possibilidade de controlar algumas coisas, mas tem muitos desvios no caminho que eu acho. E até agora não realmente tem muito êxito. A gente pode falar do soy moratório, mas no mesmo tempo tinha muito leakage a outros lugares, mudança do capital, era a flexibilidade e liberação do capital. Foi muito fácil de simplesmente os brasileiros ou outras pessoas ir para a Bolívia, mudar para Cerrado, mudar para Mato Piba. Essa dava uma impressão de desmatamento, mas em total, o desmatamento era mais complicado que isso. Então, eu tenho minhas dúvidas, mas eu acho também que não vale a pena de jogar todas essas coisas fora, porque não funciona nessa situação. E a outra coisa é que todas as ameaças, as threats do Mercosul não era tão interessante vis-à-vis Europa, porque o mercado maior é chinês e asiático. Então, eles não são tão involucrados com essas questões ambientais. E os maiores mercados são asiáticos e meio oeste, Middle East, não?
Então, Oriente Médio.
Meio Oriente. Desculpa.
A gente tinha mais uma pergunta ali no fundo. Tudo bem? Alguém quer fazer mais alguma pergunta, comentário? A gente tem algum... Não, vocês podem fazer os dois no comentário a gente faz essa última rodada de perguntas. Depois a Susanna responde. Então, primeiro. Aqui funciona também, porque daí a pessoa pode te ver.
Obrigada, Susanna. É uma panorama assim, um pouco sombria.
Mas, infelizmente.
I can speak English also.
Não, qualquer coisa.
Talvez para o público é melhor em português.
Acho melhor.
E gostei da visão um pouco freak das diferentes paisagens. E você falou do livestock, da soja, enfim, você qualificou cada um. Eu fiquei pensando, tem muito barulho e também avanços em torno, esses dias, muito debate sobre bioeconomia e economia da floresta. E eu estava curiosa de saber como, dentro da sua leitura dessas diferentes antropocenas, você vê isso. É mais propostas para o futuro, né? De como pessoas estão se organizando para tentar promover isso. Será que é um fantasma que a gente está tentando botar em pé? Será que é uma... Não sei, eu fiquei pensando um pouco como você ia ver isso.
Não, uma coisa
Vamos
que...
só pegar mais uma pergunta.
Oh, yeah.
Pedro,
Sure.
E daí depois você responde as duas
juntas. Ok.
Porque a minha pergunta, ela está relacionada um pouco com as duas anteriores.
Ok.
Primeiro, obrigado, foi maravilhosa a apresentação da senhora.
Muito obrigada a você.
A gente sabe que o discurso mainstream na governança internacional é o do desenvolvimento sustentável, né? Mas, ainda assim, no Brasil, a gente tem lideranças indígenas como o Ailton Krenak, que faz uma crítica, que ele faz até uma crítica bastante ácida, dizendo que o desenvolvimento sustentável é um mito internacional vendido para se atualizar a servidão voluntária, né? Então, eu queria, relacionando também com a pergunta anterior da colega, fazer uma provocação, assim, um exercício de imaginação. Quais seriam os pontos que são fundamentais para a gente pensar outras formas de antropoceno, que sejam diferentes da que a gente vive hoje?
Bom, eu não sei se eu tenho todas as respostas sobre o que seria a solução para desenvolvimento sustentável. O problema é que tem esses problemas de branding, que é, it's sustainable. Essa zona, a macro, madeira abunã, que é vendido agora com um tipo de sustainable development, zona de desenvolvimento sustentável. Então, é muito mais ligada à questão de advertising, de propaganda, que é uma realidade, porque essa é uma região que está explodindo. A outra coisa é o problema de greenwashing. Essa continua a ser um problema com o gado, e também tem uma interconexão bastante grande lá, que é JBS, JBS, é o maior companhia de carne no mundo, que é com problemas de corrupção nos Estados Unidos e famosamente no Brasil. Então, temos esses problemas de corrupção a uma escala bastante grande, com essas coisas de lavagem de gado, laundromat, cattle laundromat. Bom, esses dois são exemplos de uns dos problemas, mas também tem uma expansão em açaí, que continua, tem uma infraestrutura histórica vinculada com o estuário e seus pequenos produtores, que têm uma livelihood bastante legal com muitas maneiras, é um tipo de migração urbano-rural que continua a ser muito forte. Eu acho também bastante antigo. Então, essa é $1 bilhão. Então, por ano, que é uma coisa que ninguém entendia, sabia o que era, alguns anos atrás, 10 anos atrás, era um tipo de exotismo dos trópicos. Então, é coisa que eu acho, essa vai ligar também com a sua pergunta, é a questão de como se faz uma bioeconomia dentro de sistema de propriedade intelectual. Se eu quero plantar soja, usar os insumos que necessito para fazer minha enorme área de soja, eu pago uma regalia, right? Royalty, para comprar essas semillas. Então, essa é vinculada com um controle sobre o germoplasma, é por isso que é Frankenstein, né? Para continuar a produção, para usar o glifosato, e tudo isso é vinculado com private intellectual property. Então, essa é uma maneira que você pega. Mas eu tenho eu estava olhando um pouco para outras coisas e o valor de, dizemos, coca, o valor de mandioca, o valor de várias outras coisas, produtos agrícolas e produtos arboreais. E o problema é que muitas comunidades selecionam seu próprio castanha do Pará. Muitos têm seu próprio mandioca e não são produtos, dizemos, de procedência cultural e regional e não particular. Então, é muito difícil você pegar essa estratégia. Se você olha para os debates agora em cima de ayahuasca, é um outro problema, que quando se mexe um pouco com a química, então você pode patentear. Então, essa, para mim, bom, uma vantagem é a idade, entre os milhares que tem. É simplesmente que, não sei se vocês lembram, mas nos anos, início dos anos 90, tinha Shaman Pharmaceuticals, que ia fazer uma abordagem de todos os fitoquímicos de potencial em Costa Rica. Era Bayer, eu acho, Merck, uma companhia famosa para a sua consciência social. Em todo caso, o que passou é que fizeram uma investigação, Shaman Pharmaceuticals covered all this up, mas não dava um resultado. E tem alguns trabalhos, por exemplo, sobre as especificidades de milho, milho em México. E o problema é que são produtos culturais e não são individualizados. Então, se eu pego essa coisa do México e mexo um pouco com o genoma, é o meu. Mesmo se era 8.000 anos de domesticação. Então, esse, para o momento, é o problema. E existem maneiras de fazer plataformas que são um pouco mais ecologicamente justas, mas sempre estamos chegando com esse problema, que é os produtos que são genomically altered, captam todas as regalias e as coisas que são produtos culturais não entram muito bem. Então, mas tem cacau, tem café, tem açaí, que é através de um tipo de AOC, como dizem, uma classification de qualidade e região. E sobretudo a questão da região, porque essa capta a coisa não o produto em si, mas da região cultural onde foi criada. Então, essa é uma coisa, mas eu acho por o momento é um pouco complicado. Eu não estou completamente confortável. E também não existe a situação institucional ou legal que realmente adaptada à situação que existe agora no Brasil. Então, essa continua a ser undesirable, deveria ser uma coisa fabulosa, mas ninguém pode capturar o valor de maneira que se pode com mesquer, coisa assim. Bom.
Muito obrigada, Susanna.
De nada.
Fizeram perguntas.
A você?